morning. I'm delighted to be here. This is one of those few. This is one of those few occasions where both people involved in decision making and technical analysts talk with one another. This is particularly valuable that we should understand the positions of the other group, and for us as technical analysts to be able to understand what the decision makers are really trying to learn, what they really need to know in order to make valuable, useful decisions. And it's useful for them to understand what technical issues are that we're addressing, the things that we can address fully and understand very well, and the elements which Steve has described are uncertain. And the best we can do is give a forecast of a range of possible outcomes under different scenarios of what occurs in the future. Is the population growth higher than projected by the state of California demographers? Is it approximately what they project, or is it lower? What's going to happen to the economy over 20, 30, 40, or 50 years? Because we're talking about facilities that we expect will be in place at least 50 years into the future, more likely beyond 100 years into the future. So I'm going to start with the question of why is it so important to forecast high-speed rail utilization and ridership? This would seem like an obvious question with an obvious answer, and to some extent that's true. But there are some complicating factors that we have to address here. First, many high-speed rail projects, true high-speed rail, where we're talking about 220 miles per hour as the target maximum speed, are likely to be funded by a combination of public and private funds. So we need to be able to take account of the different interests, different perspectives, and different values that those different sectors of our society are using in order to make decisions. Both public and private benefits are determined to a great extent by ridership and certainly by revenue. But it's obvious those aren't the only elements. Capital expenditures and operating cost expenditures are the other big part of that picture. The public and private costs are going to be based on routes, alignments, design, the volume of ridership, which will influence costs to the extent that it causes the responsible operating agency to increase the number of trains that are making any particular run on particular days of the week. And finally, operating decisions, the frequency of service, because frequency of service is not just associated with the number of people you can carry by running more frequent trains, but also associated with a service quality. And this was mentioned earlier on more traditional rail services, where in the evening there are gaps of 3 to 4 hours between trains. So if your meeting has gone beyond its planned termination, and it's essential that you not leave early, then you may have to spend 3 or 4 hours at your non-home location, or the location that you don't want to be at tomorrow morning before you can get another train. So increasing frequency can make a big, big difference in the attraction of ridership, but also obviously the amount of cost in energy and staffing. Finally, the revenue benefit is going to be based on ridership and fare structure, and it's going to be viewed differently by the public and private sectors. So, as we look at those two sectors more carefully, we can see that the public and private investments of P&P, public and private, is based on estimated capital investment and the source allocation, that is, which entity, the public entity or the private entity, is putting in what portion of that capital. This is clearly a matter of negotiation between these entities, and there are a variety of quite complicated negotiations that will take place in these agreements, not only to do with capital, but also the distribution of operating costs and the distribution of benefits and or revenue, which is I make it the second point, talking about revenue, the allocation of revenue. It is, as the private sector operator, receive all of the benefits, irregardless of how high or low they are, except any failure to cover operating costs, or does the public entity make some guarantee that the operating losses will be limited, or do they get some share of revenue if the revenues turn out to be substantially higher than expected? So when we talk about uncertainty and risk, that can result in reduced ridership than expected, lower ridership than expected, or it may actually result in higher ridership than expected. Typically, we are asked to provide relatively conservative forecasts on ridership, so we avoid the problem of a surprise loss in annual net revenue. And it's quite possible that those conservative forecasts are excessively conservative, and the ridership will bring in a lot more income than expected. And then, presumably, the public entity should have a right to some share of that income. So we have to deal with investment, revenue, and costs, and how they're shared between public and private sectors. And focus for a moment on the private perspective, which is driven primarily by the return on investment. So the bottom line is money. The critical elements are how much of the capital cost is going to be provided by the private sector, of the annual costs, how much operating costs, maintenance costs is going to be paid by the private entity. Is it 100%? That's fairly common. Or is it going to be distributed in some way between the public and private sectors? And finally, the annual revenue from ridership and the net fares, and again, how that's going to be allocated. There's also the question of risk analysis. In the private sector, risk analysis is part of virtually any corporate decision making. Anytime a private organization makes a decision to invest money in a new product line or develop a new research development activity, they're thinking ahead to the likelihood that this is going to produce a substantial revenue stream, and also the possibility that it might produce a very limited revenue stream, or it might fail altogether in the marketplace. So the private sector is going to always be thinking very much about risk analysis. And we have many of the same elements influence the public sector. Once again, capital investment is a huge component. And as we've heard, the estimates of what that component is change sometimes very dramatically over time. One of the things I think it's important to keep in mind when people mention these tremendous differences in estimated capital investment costs, is one of the reasons for differences is because of delays in project implementation, construction. So of course some costs are going to go up because inflation is a common part of our economy. Not every year, but most years. And some years that inflation is quite substantial. So if we make an estimate in 2010, we're going to provide one number to make another estimate in 2020. For exactly the same system, we're going to come up with a different number, even if the true cost is not changing. It's just simply that the dollar becomes worth less. We also are predicting the annual cost for operation and maintenance, annual revenue as before, and the fourth item is specific to the public sector and is of no direct interest to the private sector, and that's the external benefits. From the perspective of the state and federal governments, it's very important to think about the different benefits that arise from not having to invest capital in alternative modes, highways and airports. And in some cases, the question really is more complicated than that. It's not just simply what kind of capital we have to invest, but is there any place to put more capacity? Is there a place to add more lanes in some portions of the roadway network? One of the earlier panelists mentioned the idea of double-decking roads. There are places in this country where roads are already double-decked. Well, are we going to go to 3 decks, 4 decks? It gets a little bit doubtful. We can add more lanes to a highway at ground level or above ground level, but say at ground level. But if we don't already own the right-of-way, the cost of acquiring right-of-way along the existing roadway is going to be absolutely tremendous. So, and maybe not even possible. Maybe certain places where there is no right-of-way or no additional right-of-way to acquire, because the land mass just won't support it on either side of the roadway. Or there are what we sometimes refer to as sacred cows, certain buildings or properties that we don't want to disturb. And there's a long, long list of sacred cows, certain kinds of public buildings, religious buildings, cemeteries. It's not that these can never be moved, but it's a very, very difficult kind of decision to make, and very difficult and costly to implement. We're also going to be interested in the improvements in congestion and therefore safety on the roadway system, and also to a great degree in the airline system. This is going to be very important to the public sector, not necessarily to the private sector. And finally, there's the encouragement of economic development. States are going to be particularly interested in that. The country, the United States, is going to be interested in that. One of the big elements of our economic problems at this time is our competition with other nations. And things that we do to make ourselves more efficient are likely to improve our economy relative to theirs. And the bottom line is not a return on investment, but a benefit cost analysis where we make the best judgments to turn all of these elements into dollar values and then look at the relationship between the benefits and the cost. So another question that faces us is, okay, we know forecasting is very important now. Why is it such a difficulty Why is it such a challenge? Well, there are a number of areas where we could look. The first area that you want to look at is what gaps have to be filled by data, by acquiring additional data or different kinds of data that we currently have. So I have three categories of data here: travel data, service data and prices, and contextual data. Each of those is important. Travel data is data describing how people are currently traveling in the corridors that we're looking at. What modes are they using? What times of day do they travel? How long are trips that they're making? This data typically cannot be obtained any other way than by conducting surveys, that is, contacting people directly and asking them questions about how they do travel and times and so on, and even the reasons for their travel. Certainly you can get some aggregate measures of travel just by measuring the volume on roadways, but we don't learn very much about that travel without talking to the people who are making those trips. This is a rather costly element of data to acquire. Service data and prices. So service data is the operating characteristics of all of the services that are available in any particular corridor. So how frequently, talking about train, bus, air, how frequently do vehicles or sets of vehicles, train sets, for example, depart? What kind of travel time characteristics do they have? What kind of wait times are associated with the terminals themselves? And that includes both the wait time because of infrequency of services, but also in the case of airports, it includes the wait time that's associated with security and with the airline's attempts to try to improve their on-time performance. So there was a time when you could board a flight 3 seconds before the departure time, and sometimes even 3 minutes after the departure time. Nowadays, they ask you to be boarding at least 20 minutes before, and they want the plane loaded and the doors sealed no later than that departure time. It's a very different psychology goes on there, and if you don't want to lose your reserved seats, you better be there at the time specified, because otherwise you do run that risk that you may not be on the flight you had planned to be on. Reliability is a very important element. Travelers depend very much on reliability. If I were coming from out of state to this meeting, I have to evaluate whether I can come early in the morning and get here on time. There may be a flight that would actually arrive in time to get me here if it's on time. But if it's in half an hour late and I'm on the program, especially if I'm early on the program, that's not a chance I want to take. So it means I have to depart the night before, pay for a hotel room, so on. So these kinds of issues are important. Security and safety, as I mentioned a number of times, people's perceptions about all of these elements can influence their travel decisions. And finally, of course, fares are going to be part of this analysis phenomena. And as has been mentioned earlier, the fares of the competitive services, we don't know what they're going to be because we don't know what those operators are going to do. If a high-speed rail service is implemented in a particular region, will the air carriers fight the service by lowering their fares? or will they let the business go away? We can all make guesses about that, and we can all make guesses about how much they will fight in terms of reducing fares, or how much fare reduction they can possibly stand, because they may not have that much operating process in their system in any case. We know that's true to a great degree in the airline system. Contextual data, the development patterns in the corridor that we're planning to work in, and the degree to which there are local urban transit systems that can provide connectivity or access to the new rail service. And so we look at different locations. If you look at Europe, and one of the comparisons we can make between Europe and the U.S., most of the large cities in Europe have very good transit systems. And their transit systems usually have one of their major terminals, the railroad station. That's not true in the United States. Very few of our cities have well-integrated transit systems. And the airport is more important here than in Europe. Is not necessarily well connected to those transit systems. Even in cases like Chicago, and there are other cases, where there are good transit services to the airport, surveys have taught us that most of the riders are people who work at the airport. They're not passengers who are using that for a trip. Why not? Well, they can think of a lot of reasons. One is carrying luggage is more of a problem. Another might be that they worked a long, hard day. They're going to have to fly for a few hours before they get to their destination. So they really want to relax. They don't want to have to deal with the transit system. So the degree to which there is that service in some places is important, particularly important in places where the transit system and the intercity rail system can get you to your destination for a one-day round trip, so you don't have to carry luggage, or even an overnight round trip. Some of us can pack very, very light for an overnight round trip, and business people who are on the road regularly are kind of quite expert about that. So it raised all these challenges, and so and talks about data sources. But I don't want to answer all these questions, so I have an expert here, getting up, Kimon Proussaloglou, who does this for a living, who's going to answer these questions for us.
Well, as we've heard earlier today, there have been a variety of perspectives on how high-speed rail could or could not be successful. If there is one thing I think we can agree on is let's look at the data. Let's have forecasts that are data-driven. Let's make sure we agree on the underlying data, both for the population and employment and the current travel. And then let's develop a model, a set of statistical relationships that allow us to forecast what-if scenarios going into the future. So as we're evaluating those very expensive projects, be it incremental improvements in the Northeast Corridor or totally new systems as in California and extensions of the system in the Midwest, we need to have a sense of how big the market is. How big is this intercity market? And unfortunately, the types of data that we have date back to 1995 when the last American travel survey was conducted. So every study that looks at high-speed rail today needs to assemble data from the ground up instead of rely on the 1995 data. So we can collect data by mode. We can find the air travel, we can find the rail travel, and then we need to go to state DOTs and MPOs to have an assessment of highway travel. However, all of these data are not very useful because they are not allowing us to evaluate the trade-offs that travelers make. We need to go out and collect what are called revealed surveys, namely the current behavior of travelers, and stated preference surveys, namely how are travelers likely to react to a new proposed high-speed rail system. We need to agree that models are a tool that allow us to evaluate alternative scenarios. Models are not crystal balls. We need to evaluate trip generation, meaning how many trips, what is the total amount of travel, where are these trips going, what are the destinations, what mode are they likely to use, and finally, how will they be assigned to the network. We need to have a household survey that tells us the total amount of travel today. We need to supplement it with intercept surveys at air terminals, at rail stations, and on board trains, and we need to ask the what-if questions. What if high-speed rail service were available? And I will get to that in a minute. We need to assemble highway networks, rail and air networks to have a proper representation of what the current level of service is. And last but not least, we need to subject the data we collect and the models that we develop to a reality test. Are the traffic counts and the rail and air ridership actually reflected in the final results of the model we're developing? And last but not least, the critical link here is between the stated preference survey and the mode choice behavior. We need to recognize the uncertainty that is inherent in data collection that asks about a mode that is not currently available. So, how do we go about it? We present travelers with a recent trip. We actually present customized experiments to air travelers, rail travelers, and automobile drivers, and we describe to them their existing options. This is what traveling by car from your origin to your destination would take. It would take you 6.5 hours. You would have an 80% chance of arriving there within 15 minutes of the typical time, and when it's all said and done, it would cost you $70 to travel. If you travel by air, the travel time would be about 1 hour and 20 minutes. You should arrive to the airport an hour earlier, and there is a flight every hour. However, there is a higher or lower probability of flights arriving on time, and the round trip fare is 320. And in the same dry manner, we need to present to them what high-speed rail would be like. We do not want to use glossy pictures. We simply want to tell them that you need to arrive there 10 to 15 minutes before your train. The travel time would actually be longer than air, but considerably shorter than car, about 2 hours and 40 minutes. And you would have a higher level of on-time reliability, and the cost would be $140. And this is an example of the types of experiments we provide to people. It is not a simple question, would you ride high-speed rail if it were available? This would cause tremendous biases, but we need to force trade-offs here, repeat people or subject people to multiple experiments, and then analyze them in a choice context to understand both current choices and future choices. Having resolved the data, we then need to look at the methodological challenges that we face.
So I get the opportunity to ask some more questions that Kimon will come back and answer. And I was reminded by Steve to watch the clock, so we're going to accelerate our pace a little bit. So one of the methodological challenges, we have procedures that have been developed over a number of years for making predictions, and they consist of using models that cover the decisions that people make about a range of choices that are relevant to whether they actually will use high-speed rail or not. So there might be an initial question of determining whether they're committed to their car, and then move on to also thinking how many cars are in their household versus how many drivers are in their household, so whether the car is available to them. And then to look at the other non-car codes that are available. Those questions and those answers are likely to vary depending on the length of the trip and the travel times associated with the different alternatives. The models that we have a variety of different structures which represent different degrees of competition between different alternatives. And Kimon will come back and talk about that. These models provide an evaluation function for each of the alternatives that are being considered. We call that a utility function, but it's really just some assessment of how good this alternative is in some empirical terms. And that function can be simple or complex. It can have a small number of variables in it or a large number of variables in it. All these are decisions that have to be made by the modeling team and are dependent part on the kind of data that is available. And finally, it's necessary to estimate the parameters of the model. The parameters are the numbers that multiply travel time by some value to turn it into a common measure of value. So I get the chance again to pass this back.
So models are tools, but more often than not, they are perceived as black boxes, and sometimes for good reason. I should have actually added a button because, you press the button and numbers come out. And most of the discussion with peer review panels and the exchange that we heard this morning effectively rely on and deal with what is in that black box. That is, as long as we are in agreement that the relationships that are in the black box properly reflect current behavior and are reasonable to assess future behavior, we are all in a better place. So we apply the model system, we get our ridership forecast and our traffic forecast, but we should not underestimate that any forecast that we get is a conditional one. It is conditional on the level of congestion on the highway network, the population and employment that we see today, not just totals, but the distribution of it, the land use around the stations, transit network, and last but not least, service and pricing. So some of the questions that the panel was arguing today need answers to the following. What is the market size? Again, the lack of a nationwide travel survey is actually a handicap here. Where are trips going to? What are the key travel markets? What share of each one of those markets is high-speed rail likely to attract? And we heard a lot of statistics. Statistics at the state level are very different than the statistics at the corridor level, and they're very different at a very well-defined buffer around the corridor. So a 1% rail market share of Amtrak in California is very different about the potential market between San Francisco and LA and what is the current market share today. So these are the types of questions that the model components are asked to provide. And again, sometimes you know why between the discussion today and my distinguished colleagues here, project teams find themselves between a rock and a hard place. These gentlemen are rock, the gentlemen this morning are a hard place. So we need to develop estimates that actually inform the decision-making process, as Joe said. So what Frank talked about in abstract, the type of model, if we need to evaluate running times, our models need to be sensitive to travel time. If we need to identify station locations, what is the walk time and what is the drive access time, and how does it affect decisions? Schedule convenience was brought up, the connectivity and the number of transfers as well, of course pricing, both today as well as competitive reactions in the future, gasoline prices. In one of the studies we've done, we had to actually evaluate two alternative future year scenarios about how both gas prices are likely to rise or remain steady, as well as the fuel economy of vehicles, and what would that translate into a number of in terms of the costs that drivers would actually pay. We are talking about models. They are statistical relationships, and again, the more disaggregate, the more detailed, the more they are linked to an individual traveler, the better off we are, because we understand these decisions one by one. The top row is how many trips is a household and a traveler likely to make as a function of the socioeconomic characteristics, their income. The second one is where are they likely to go, given the distribution of destinations in the state of California, for example, or in the Midwest. What are the major attractors? What are the flows to Chicago versus Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and Detroit? In each of these markets, what are the current market shares and what is the likely market share of high-speed rail? And last but not least, to address the connectivity question, how are passengers and travelers likely to go there to access the station or airport, and how are they likely to move away from it? Inside the black box, and this is a graphical representation, are relationships like these. So, if you look at a trip that takes 2.5 hours, and there is a half hour to access the station, or 15 minutes, another 45 minutes to wait, a travel time of just above an hour, and then another 15 minutes to go to your final destination. This is the actual travel time. However, what is really important is the perceived travel time. So this is where the relative importance of those different components have a major role to play. And it is very important because the types of service that we are actually evaluating in high-speed rail, they have a different mix of wait time, in-vehicle time, access, and egress. So we need to understand how people evaluate those individual components today to be able to project in the future.
It's like a ping pong match here. Another element of interest to us is what's the nature of uncertainty in the environment in which we're working, and how can we address it? So this is a huge challenge in forecasting. First of all, the models that we use are probabilistic. That is, they don't predict for a particular individual that he or she will travel to a particular destination at a particular time by a particular means of transport. What we do is we predict a probability that that individual will make that particular trip in that manner, and probabilities for all the other possible ways of making the trip. And we evaluate the models in terms of how close our probabilities are to 1 for the trip the traveler actually made, and contrarily, how small they are for trips that they don't actually make. The future context is uncertain. We don't know at this time for certain the frequency of train service. We may think we know what the design of the vehicles is going to be, but we're not sure. Will it have Wi-Fi connectivity? Probably. If so, how fast will that connectivity be? Will it be interrupted regularly, or will it be reliable over most of the trip? We also need forecasts of other future year inputs. So we want to know things about the economy in the future, and we're not going to take on that task. We already have a huge task to deal with, but we're going to go to the state or regional agencies or the federal government and say, give us your prediction of population growth, of economic growth, changes in development patterns over the period of time. We also need to make some estimate of the degree to which people are going to be comfortable with the idea of high-speed rail. Will they accept it? And there are many people I've talked to from this audience who just are tremendously excited about high-speed rail. There are other people who say, wow, I don't know, I just felt a little bit strange moving that fast through the country. It's not like moving that fast in the air, 20,000 feet up, where you can't see anything close. But if you're traveling at or near the surface, you can see trees going by, and they really go by perfectly. It makes some people quite uncomfortable. We also don't know what future operating and pricing conditions are going to be. Particularly, we don't know what the energy costs are going to be. Whatever energy technology we use, we don't know what the energy costs are likely to be. Almost certainly, they're going to be higher than today's energy costs, but what? We don't know. And technology decisions will be based partially on that expected cost, and we'll incorporate that into models. And finally, the real-world competitive responses. What are other carriers serving the same corridor going to be doing about maintaining their market? How are they going to change their prices? How might they change their service? If they improve the frequency, improve the seating, there are a variety of things that they have at their command. So, for the answers.
So we talk about uncertainty, and we all realize that there is no comparable high-speed rail service in the U.S., for example, to use as a guiding post for the California high-speed rail forecasts. We also recognize that we analyze observed behavior, and we are making conjectures and forecasts for a new mode using the state preference surveys. So, in doing the best job possible, we need to address the acceptance of high-speed rail, not on average, but for distinct market segments. What is the profile of the likely high-speed rail rider in the future? How is it comparable to or different than the profile of the current Amtrak rider? How is that likely to change for business trips versus non-business trips? How is the likelihood of adopting high-speed rail and riding high-speed rail different for short-distance trips versus long-distance trips? By doing the market segmentation at that level, we are able to compare responses within the population and within the people who are likely to accept high-speed rail. A technical term is the so-called high-speed rail constant. It is often accused for resulting in very optimistic high-speed rail forecasts. I think extreme care needs to be taken in positioning high-speed rail as improved rail service somewhere between the rail and air in the rail-to-air continuum. We should be very careful about making the so-called high-speed rail constant, the attractiveness of high-speed rail over and above the level of service and cost characteristics, very optimistic. Last but not least, we need to stress test the model. And one of the things we are doing in the California High-Speed Rail project under the auspices of the peer review panel is to examine in great detail the sensitivity of the model to different scenarios. What if travel times improve? What if frequency gets increased? The point of this slide is that after it's all said and done and we've developed the model, we have somewhere to stand because our ridership and traffic forecasts can be contrasted against the observed ridership. And we can go back into the model system and adjust it until the ridership forecasts that we get are an accurate representation of what is happening today. However, when we think about the future, the uncertainty relates to total travel, population, and employment are critical. The distribution is also critical. Traveler incomes, and Steve and Frank talked about all of those. Getting different estimates and producing different forecasts for a range of these estimates, we believe, is critical to understand the entire pie. Secondly, competitive landscape. What are the inputs, the gasoline costs? How are they likely to grow over the next 10, 15, 20 years? The highway level of service and the competitive response. Again, we translate those abstract concepts into scenarios, and then we evaluate those scenarios to come up with different estimates of ridership. So on the left-hand side, just to give you the uncertainty that is inherent in all of this, we need to come up with 2035 estimates for the network, the land use, service and pricing. We need to deal with high-speed rail in a way that is reasonable and conservative through the model system to give us the forecast. I want to leave you with an example, and this is not high-speed rail, this is an urban rail example. We were working on a study that projected 5,000 daily boardings on an urban system, and a previous study had projected 20. So I knew that the inevitable question would be, how come your study is 5,000, the other study is 20,000? So we started looking at the assumptions, which I think are critical, and this is the key takeaway from our work. Looking at the, for example, the characteristics of the system we evaluate versus the previous study, it was obvious to a casual reader that these were two totally different transit systems. We evaluated 30-minute headways in the peak and 60 in the off-peak. That other system had 5 and 10 with more frequent stations. So we're talking about a totally different type of rail service. That system also used a lower fare. It imposed downtown parking increased downtown parking, and last but not least, it concentrated the development around key stations. So when we used our model, the one that predicted 5,000 riders to these conditions, we were very close to the other estimate. Critical to understand the input assumptions, critical to be very transparent about them, critical to develop the range of outcomes, to evaluate those what-if scenarios as opposed to talk about them in the abstract. And last but not least, the Northeast Corridor, we believe, provides a good example of replicating these conditions and saying, what if a certain new system had the level of service characteristics that the Northeast Corridor has? What is the actual ridership that the model gives me? If it is close enough, then we have a robust model. Last but not least, we need to look into international experience, of course. We need to be aware of all kinds of differences there. But taken together, applying the model and pressing it, test pressing it, and making sure the numbers we get, the range we get, bound the reality is a critical aspect. So, in conclusion, Frank will talk about the judgment and peer review panel. That's the only slide that remains, and what the role of those panels is.
It should be clear from the things we have said that the people involved in forecasting are making a variety of judgments. They're looking at the range of predictions of various future external elements like population and economy, and they're selecting a range to use as inputs to their various forecasts. And typically they'll make a number of forecasts with different values so that we can see what the range of possible outcomes is likely to be. Historically, in working in the public sector, which many of us have done, decision makers like to get a single number. They wanted to know what was the ridership, what was the revenue. And for a political authority, this is a very important issue, because if you are the authority that approves a particular project and you get a lot of acclaim when you cut the ribbon, open up stations, open up lines, and then the ridership comes out to be 1/2 or 1/4 of what you had said it would be, this does not look good. You do not stay in office by making decisions and having them come out poorly. So the way in which this was handled typically was to make conservative forecasts. Okay, that's fine, that's perfectly reasonable. But to have a single number forecast, not to go in with a wide variety of forecasts where the maximum forecast might be almost twice the minimum forecast, or maybe more than twice the minimum forecast. So you want to compress that range. So how do you minimize the errors in judgment that might be made? One of the ways has just been part of high-speed rail studies in this country for about 25 years or more. That's the right number, right? Ray Ellis over here was one of the people who authored those guidelines. Is that there should be a peer review panel. What's the peer review panel? Well, peers equals people with similar or greater levels of expertise than people who are doing the work are asked to review typically they are a panel, not one person. So a panel of, say, 5 people would be a reasonable number. And the panel reviews everything. And in many cases, they send things back to the contractor that's doing the work to say, we're not satisfied with the way this was done. We'd like to see your procedures laid out more carefully. And if we're not satisfied with that, we say, yeah, you have to go back and do it again, and you should be making different assumptions that you want to be made. This is, of course, it can be lead to a certain amount of confrontation. In the best environments, it can be a good intellectual collaboration where we exchange ideas, we learn from one another, and we get better results. We make better judgments, we use better methods, and all the way around, we get improvements. So, in my mind, there are 3 essential attributes of peer review panels. One is all the members should be highly qualified in areas relevant to the forecasting, and they should be recognized as being highly qualified. Second, they should be independent and have no conflicts of interest. No relationships that would cause them to try to bias results. And third, they should have diverse perspectives. They should come from diverse backgrounds. So the panel that I chair in California has 1 member from Switzerland, 1 from Canada, the others are from the U.S. Most of us are academics, but we do have a very experienced practitioner as part of our group. Our academic expertise is in slightly different areas, but they all overlap in this general area. And the approach, and I think this is critical, is that the panel should be involved very early in the process. I have been situations that I don't think I'll be in the future, where the panel, the project is halfway or 2/3 of the way through its budget, and they form a panel, and you're at the point where you look at this, and basically they're looking for an answer: can we proceed with this model or not? And it's clear that after that much money has been spent, no one wants to hear the not answer. This is really a very uncomfortable situation for everybody, and it's not an effective way to do this job. Bringing the panel on earlier is going to cost more money, both because of the cost of the panel, but also it will cost more money for the contractor, who will be forced to redo work at various times. The additional cost is such a tiny fraction of the investment cost and the ridership revenue that we're talking about. This is an expenditure that's more than worthwhile. The panel should have access to all relevant reports, and the panel should report directly to the highest authority responsible for that system. So our panel writes its reports to the Chief Executive Officer of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. And in that role, I've also talked directly with members of his board of directors and also with the governor, so that they can be convinced that we're giving them exactly what we believe and the honest answers. So we are not to be advocates for or against the system. Our advocacy is for getting the best understanding of what the likely outcomes will be. And really, that should be a common objective. The governor, the authority, the panelists, and the contractor, and there are other contractors, of course, who are estimating the capital costs, the other components of this. should have the same objective. We're trying to give an honest answer, best answer possible, so that a good decision is made. And now is your opportunity to ask questions. So,
I've been discussing this with my boss, Mr.